All right, take your Bible out or your phone and find the Bible app. And we're going to be in Genesis chapter 40. Hang on, let me tell you. Chapter 42. Now, we're actually going to cover about 5 chapters of the Bible today. Is that good with you? You ready to skip lunch? Some of you got scared, didn't you? All right, we are going to cover a lot of ground this morning. So one of the best things you can do is take that program, flip it over, and you can take some notes. But take your phone, if you've got the Bible app, you can find the little 3 dots or 3 lines and go to events and then search for Cane Bay, and all the notes will be there. They'll also be on the screen. But we got a lot of ground to cover to finish the story of Joseph today. Now, if you weren't here over the last 2 weeks, I would say go to our Facebook page and you can watch the last 2 weeks to catch up on the story so all this makes sense today. But let me just set it up by saying this. The one question that we've been asking for the last few weeks, the big idea for this whole series on the life of Joseph is this. What would somebody in your circumstance do? Now, when I say your circumstance, what I mean is your job, maybe your marriage or your singleness or your school or in your neighborhood, with your neighbors, with your money, with your skills, with your past, with your present, with your addiction, with your habits. What would a person with your circumstance that's in your shoes right now do if you absolutely knew that God was with you in the middle of it? Now, I know that's a simple question, but it's profound. What would somebody do if they were in the middle of where you are right now, but they knew without a doubt that God was in the middle of it with you? If you knew that, I think it would change how you see things around you, how you see yourself, how you make decisions. If you know that God is not absent or distant, He is right there in the middle of it with you and He has a plan. I think it would change everything. So say you're a mom with little kids and you just moved here because your husband got transferred here with his job and you didn't necessarily want to move to Cane Bay in South Carolina, but here you are and you miss all of your friends from back home and you're here. What would you do if you knew God was with you and He has a plan for you? What if you're a student who you're about to graduate high school, or you just graduated, you just started college, but you knew that in your school or with your uncertainty about what you're going to do with life or where you're going to go, but you knew that God was with you. What would you do if you're single and you were dating somebody and it didn't work out, or you were engaged and it didn't work out, or you're hoping to get married but you just don't know if that's ever going? What would you do if you knew that right now, in whatever circumstance you're in, you're sure that God is absolutely with you and that He hasn't left you? What if you're a person who just started a new business and it's not working out so great and you're trying to make it work and you've invested your life savings in it? What if you're a person who's struggling with finances right now and you don't know what to do? What if you're a person who just got married? We just had a wedding this weekend. Anybody just got married in the room? What if you just got married and you're filled with hopes and dreams? Or you're a person who you just walked through a hard divorce or in the middle of a separation? What would you do if you knew God was in the middle of it with you? For the last 3 weeks, we've been following the story of this guy named Joseph, and it started 3 weeks ago when he was 17 years old. He was 17 years old, and he was abandoned by his own family. His own brothers, his big brothers, threw him into a pit to die. They sold him into slavery. He was taken to a foreign land, to Egypt, where he didn't speak the language. He was accused of rape. He was put in prison for years and forgotten about. And yet there's this strange little phrase that keeps getting repeated in his story that says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." And you think to yourself, well, it doesn't make much sense, because if the Lord is with you, wouldn't good things happen? That's actually not exactly true. You think if the Lord is with you, surely bad things wouldn't come. But here's the thing we learn in the story of Joseph, that things can be very, very bad, and yet God can be very, very close. Are you with me? Are you here? Some of you are you with me? Listen, I need you to know something that's true, and maybe you haven't heard this before or thought about it, but things can be very hard and very bad, and God can be very near. In fact, the Bible says that he is close to the brokenhearted, that you will have trials and pain in this world, but God is never going to walk away from you. The question is not how do I change my circumstances, but what would someone in my circumstances do if they knew that God was with them in the middle of those circumstances? Because that's what the Bible promises. Then last week what we saw is Joseph went from prison, a dungeon, to all of a sudden being appointed as the second most powerful leader in all of the world. It's the craziest story of extremes you've ever seen. This guy is left for dead and sold into slavery, and now all of a sudden, through the interpretation of somebody else's dream, he's seen as this really wise strategist, and the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, puts him in charge as like the prime minister of the entire country of Egypt, which just happened to be the most powerful country in the world at the time. And all of a sudden, Joseph has more power and wealth and success than you and I will probably ever know. Circumstances change for Joseph, but what you see the first week is that the low things, the bad things, the hard things didn't derail him, and then the wealthy things, the powerful things, the good things didn't distract him. This is the lesson for you and I in this life, is we would live through the lows and live through the highs as a person confident that God is with them. It would change the way we see the highs and the lows. You with me? Today, Joseph faces probably the most difficult test of them all. Last week, what we saw is that Joseph was appointed as this prime minister of Egypt, and he had to oversee 7 years of prosperity for Egypt. So things were good. Food was plentiful. Money was everywhere. The economy was doing great. Everybody was doing well. They had 7 years of prosperity. But then there were 7 years, they were facing 7 years of famine. And today, what we're going to see today in the story is that Joseph had ruled in Egypt for about 10 years. So 7 years of prosperity, and then let's do a little math. How many years are they now in famine if he's ruled for 10 years? 3. Are y'all listening? Okay. So he ruled for 7 years during famine, and now he's during prosperity. Sorry, maybe I'm not listening either. 7 years of prosperity, and now he's 3 years into this famine. And what's happening is people are starving. They're hungry. People don't have food. The crops aren't producing. The economy has tanked. Everything's bad. And people from all over Egypt they're coming to Joseph to say, we need food. We need help. We need the government to give us some stimulus. All right, not really, but kind of. So that's what he's doing. He's handing out food. And so the grain that they've stored up over the 7 years, because of the strategy of Joseph, now they're giving out that grain. And people from other countries are coming to Egypt because Egypt has stored up grain. And this is where it gets really interesting. So here we are in Genesis chapter 42, verse 1, and I want you to look at what happens. It says, Genesis 42:1 says, when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at one another? All right, so stop right there. Who's Jacob? You guys, come on. All right, maybe you weren't here the last few weeks. Joseph's dad is Jacob. All right, good. So now we know, all of a sudden we hear about Jacob. We haven't heard from him since week 1 of this thing. Like all of a sudden, Jacob, Joseph's dad, who has long since been lost from Joseph. Joseph was disconnected, sold into slavery, all that stuff. And all of a sudden Jacob, his dad, enters back into the story. And we learn that he's living in a place that's experiencing famine, and they're hungry, they're starving. And he says to his son, he learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt. And he says to his boys, Joseph's bigger brothers, why are you guys just standing around looking at each other? You don't think that's funny, do you? Anyway, all right. So look what he says, verse 2. And he said, behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. So he's going to send his boys, Joseph's older brothers, that he hasn't seen in many years, to Egypt to buy grain. So verse 3 says, so 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. Now this is getting crazy. Are you with me? Do you know where this is going? Maybe you know the story, but look, this is great. Joseph's about 40 years old at this point. Remember, he was sold into slavery at 17. So he's been in Egypt for about 23 years. Disconnected from his family, lost everything from his past, spent many years in very difficult circumstances, but now he's the prime minister of Egypt. And his older brothers that sold him into slavery are about to come to buy grain from Egypt, and they have no idea who they're about to buy grain from. Look at verse 6. God's just reminding us here of the circumstances. It says, now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Now remember, Joseph's 40 years old. He's not a kid anymore. He's got all this Egyptian garb on. He's an Egyptian official. He's second in command over all the land. His brothers have no idea who he is. They don't recognize him at all. They bow their faces before to the ground because they're foreigners, and they're about to ask this Egyptian leader, can we have some grain? This is like justice, right? I mean, in this world, we often have this desire that what goes around comes around, right? And all of a sudden, you see in this story, these are the guys who ripped Joseph's life away from him and left him to die. And now they're on their face before him groveling, please, sir, can we have some grain? What are the odds? Joseph clearly at this moment, it's almost as if God has delivered into his hands his worst enemy. With one word, these guys could be history. With one word, Joseph can order them to be executed, throw them into jail, do whatever he wants to do, because he has all the power in this moment. The question is, what would somebody in this moment do if they knew that the God of all the universe was with them? And the answer to that question changes what you do in that moment. And this is significant because at some point in your life and in my life, we've been hurt by somebody, right? Can we just be honest about that for a minute? You guys with me? At some point, someone has hurt you. And it may be that at some point in your life, you have the power or the ability to pay them back for what they've done. In some way. I mean, maybe it's in a big way like Joseph. Maybe it's in small ways, just by freezing them out or not communicating with them, not talking to them, withholding your grandkids from them because of what they did to you. Well, maybe it's just maybe it's a boss that you work for and you have the ability to somehow get them back for the way they've treated you. Maybe it's that your mom and dad weren't too great. One of them maybe rejected you, or both of them, or ignored you, or hurt you, or neglected you. And you grew up with lots of pain or heartache or difficulty because of a rotten parent. But now they're older and you have the power to either love and care or not. You have the power. And maybe they have the nerve to act like nothing ever happened. Maybe they never came to terms with what they did to you. And you have the power to either not speak to them or, like I said, withhold their grandkids from them or just remind them of how hurtful they've been. Maybe it's an older brother, an older sister, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, an ex-spouse. Maybe you were the recipient of so much rejection and hurt, and they have no idea what they did to you. Maybe it's somebody that was supposed to care about you and keep you safe, and they didn't do it. And maybe they have no idea the pain that it caused. Time has gone by. What would a person do in those circumstances, with that kind of hurt, do if they knew God was with them? You know, there's a phrase in our world that is this, that hurt people often hurt people, right? Why would we say that? Because when we've been hurt, the natural thing, the human thing, the fleshly thing is to pay back with hurt. Like if you've hurt me, then there's something fleshly about me that wants you to experience the same kind of hurt that I've experienced, or at least some kind of hurt. There's something inside of us that wants to get even. There's something inside us that wants the other person to pay, or at least know what they've done. One day, I think we all will have the opportunity to make someone pay for what they've done to us. What do you do in that moment with that opportunity if you know that God is with you? So look what Joseph does. So here's what happens. They're bowing on their face in front of Joseph, right? They're asking for grain. They have no idea who he is. He recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. Now it's interesting because it starts off with Joseph doing this. What you see is Joseph all of a sudden accuses them of being spies. And then you think, oh yeah, he's going to get them, right? He's going to get them back for what they did. He accuses them of spies, of being spies. He throws them into jail for a few days, and then he comes up with a plan. And he says, you know what? I'm going to take one of your brothers, and I'm going to keep them here. So he takes Simeon, one of the brothers, and he keeps him in Egypt, and he sends the other brothers back to their homeland for them to get their youngest brother, Benjamin. The only brother they didn't bring was Joseph's baby brother, Benjamin. And they've told him about Benjamin being back home and stuff, and he said, okay, here's the deal. I'll make a deal with you. I'll keep one brother here. I'll send the rest of you back to get your baby brother, bring him back so I know you're not lying, and then I'll give you grain and you can go. Now, why does he come up with this plan? I mean, I think it's honestly because he wants to see his baby brother that he hasn't seen in 23 years. And he wants to make sure he's actually still alive. Maybe that's why. So he comes up with this plan. He sends them back. And they're probably thinking at this moment, actually the Bible tells us at this moment, that they're thinking, God is getting us back for what we did to Joseph all those years ago. This is why this is happening to us. So what happens is they get home to Jacob, their dad, and they told him that they have to take Benjamin, the baby, the youngest brother, back to Egypt so that they can get Simeon, their older brother, out of jail and get the grain and come home. And so they tell the dad this, and Jacob goes, I'm not going to let you take Benjamin. Remember, he's lost a son, Joseph, before, and he's like, I'm not going to let you take Benjamin too. I'm not going to let you take him. And so they probably say something like, but what about Simeon, Dad? He's stuck in jail. And Jacob just goes, well, things happen. The Bible doesn't say that, but anyway. But Jacob says, you're not going back there. I'm not losing another son, which is crazy because he is losing. Anyway, Jacob doesn't let them return. And eventually what happens, here's the interesting thing. What I didn't tell you is that in all of that, you think Joseph is like getting them back with this whole plan, but do you know what happened when they left Egypt and they went home to go back to get Benjamin? Joseph actually packed all of their bags with grain. He packed all their bags with grain, and guess what else? The money that they brought for grain that he confiscated, he put it back in their bags with the grain. And all of a sudden, with him doing that, you catch a glimpse of Joseph's heart. He's actually not paying them back at all. He's actually giving them back what they don't deserve. And that's going to give you a sneak peek into the rest of the story. Years go by, Actually, I don't know how long goes by, but they run out of the grain that Joseph sent them with, and they're starving again. And finally, Jacob, the dad, relents and says, okay, take Benjamin. We're going to die if you don't go back to Egypt and get more grain. And so they take their little brother Benjamin back to Egypt. They get there, and then Joseph decides to do something really unusual. He invites all of the brothers who have returned to Egypt to come and have a meal in his palace, in his home, around a great table. Now, this is crazy because the brothers are probably thinking, what in the world is going on? He set this big feast before them, and they walk into the room. And when Joseph sees his little brother Benjamin, the Bible says that he started to weep. He started to cry. Look at Genesis chapter 43, verse 30. I told you we were going to skip forward. Chapter 43, verse 30, it says this. Then Joseph hurried out of the room, for his compassion grew warm for his brother Benjamin. And he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. And then he washed his face and he came out. And controlling himself, he said, serve the food. And his brothers are probably weirded out by this because he had to leave the room because he was crying. And he comes back in the room. The table's been set. They're about to eat a huge banquet. So strange. Guess what's even stranger? As Joseph sits them at the table, guess what he does? He seats them in birth order. You with me? He sits them according to birth order at the table. These guys are going, okay, what is going on? They sit down, they eat, and then Joseph gives them all the grain that they came for, gives them their brother Simeon that was locked up, sends Benjamin with them, packs all their bags with grain, and sends them home. But Joseph actually hides his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And what happens is they get to the edge of town, and he sends the police, Joseph sends the police to stop them and to bring them back. And they bring them back. I'm sure his brothers are, this whole thing is just so weird. They get them back, and then they search their bags. And when they get to Benjamin's bag, they find the silver cup. And Joseph accuses them of being thieves. And they're going to be thrown into jail. And Benjamin, because he stole it, is probably going to be arrested and put in prison and not be able to return home to his dad. And what was the one thing the dad feared? That he would lose Benjamin, his youngest son. And so Judah, one of the oldest brothers, steps forward and says, sir, he says to Joseph, who, remember, he still doesn't know who Joseph is. He says, sir, take me, put me in prison, arrest me, but please don't take Benjamin. Because if you take Benjamin, my father is literally going to die. In this moment, everything's quiet. And Joseph, speaking in Hebrew, not Egyptian, says out loud in Genesis 45, verse 3, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Can you imagine this moment? Then Joseph says, is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him. It says, for they were dismayed at his presence. Of course they couldn't answer him. They're standing there, and all of a sudden this 40-year-old Egyptian ruler says, I'm your brother. I'm the one. I'm the one you hated. I'm the one you tried to kill. I'm the one you sold. Verse 4, it says, so Joseph said to his brothers, now this is almost funny. He says to his brothers, come near to me, please. Actually, he probably didn't say it like that, but if I was his brothers, I'm thinking that's the way he said it. Let me get a closer look at you. He says to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold to Egypt. And they say, oh, hey, Joseph, what's up? Y'all are not getting any of my humor today. That's okay. At this point, they have to be beside themselves. Their life is flashing before their eyes. They've come face to face with their own sinfulness. Look at verse 5. Joseph has more to say. Look what he says. He says, and now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God, you see that? For God sent me before you to preserve life. Time out. Joseph looks at his brothers who ripped his life away from him. And he says, I'm your brother, the one you sold. But I don't want you to be angry with yourself because it's not you who did it. Actually, God did it. And God had a plan. Now, why would he even say that? I think he spent 23 years wrestling with the Lord about this and knowing that God never left him and seeing what God has been doing in it. And he's absolutely confident that even though you sold me and you hated me and you tried to kill me, that the God who made me and knows me and loves me has never left me. And he's used it to save people's lives. You see, though God could have stopped what happened to Joseph, I don't know if you believe this, but God could have stopped all that. God has the power to prevent pain if he wants to. God has the power to do miraculous things. He could have stopped Joseph from being thrown in the pit, stopped Joseph from being accused of rape, stopped Joseph from being sold, stopped Joseph from being thrown into prison for years. Though God could have stopped it, he chose instead to use it for bigger purposes. So even though God may have seemed silent and distant, he wasn't absent. God was using things for his purpose, and somehow Joseph believes that deep in his heart. You're probably thinking right now, you mean God would allow Joseph to be thrown in a pit, sold as a slave, accused of rape, put in prison for years and forgotten? Yes. I don't know if that just wrecks your view of God, but yes, God allowed it. Because God knows more than you and me. And he's God and he's sovereign. And somehow he can use hard things to accomplish good things. I don't know why your mom or dad was the way they were. I don't know why your ex-spouse or your marriage was the way it was. I don't know why your friend did the thing that they did, or your boss or your work or your finances. I just don't know. But I know that God is not shocked, surprised, or impotent, and he's right there in the middle of it with you, and he will never leave you. And though he may seem silent, he is not absent, and he never has been. Look at verse 8 of Genesis 45. Joseph continues, he said, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. Man, that takes some maturity in a relationship with God to say that. He says, God has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Then look what he says to his brothers. He says, hurry up and go to my father, Jacob, and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and do not tarry. Look at verse 10. It gets crazier. Joseph says, you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. In other words, Joseph says to his brothers, go back and get our dad and bring him here, and you can live with me. and I will take care of you, and I'll pay for all of it, and I'll provide, and you will eat, and you won't be poor, and you won't lack, because I'm going to see to it that you're cared for. Why? These are the guys who hurt him. Why does Joseph do such a thing? That's exactly what happens. They go back, they get their dad, they move there. Joseph takes care of them for years and years and years. Why would you do such a thing? Because that's the kind of thing you do when you know that God has been with you and that God has never left you and he has given you mercy and grace and forgiveness. Then you just can't withhold it from other people. I mean, I'm not saying it was easy for Joseph. Joseph's probably wrestled with this for 23 years. Joseph probably had many dreams of paying them back. Joseph felt deeply hurt. In fact, I want you to look in just a minute. We're going to get to it, but I just want you to know this. You begin to see the good that can come from the bad when you acknowledge that God was with you in the bad and you refuse to play God when things are good. Let me just say that again. I believe that you begin to see the good things God can bring from the bad or the hard things in your life when you acknowledge that God was always with you and that he has a plan, and you refuse to, when things are good, to play God yourself. So Joseph's fathers, their brothers, they all moved to Egypt. They're all cared for by Joseph. Look at Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. So Genesis chapter 50, verse 15 says this. When Joseph's brother, okay, so wait, before you get there. Years pass, Jacob, the dad, dies. They've been in Egypt for many years now. Jacob dies of old age. Look what it says in verse 15. His brothers think now's the time that Joseph is probably going to pay us back. Now that dad's gone, Joseph's going to make things get even with us. Look at verse 15. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. He's been caring for him for years. Here's the thing though. When you do evil to somebody else, it's always sitting on your shoulder, isn't it? It's always right there behind you. They're worried now that dad's gone that they're going to get paid back. Verse 16, so they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. They sent a message to Joseph saying, hey, dad said this. Look at verse 17. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sins because they did evil to you. See what they're doing? Hey, Joseph, dad said his dying wish was that you would just really forgive us. Did dad say it? I don't know. But this is what they say. And then look at what it says. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Why did Joseph weep in this moment? Why do you think he cried? You know what I think? I don't think in this story, and I hope you haven't heard this over the last few weeks, I don't think for a moment that when you are confident that God's with you, that all hurt just doesn't hurt anymore. No, we haven't said that at all. When you're hurt by people, it hurts, right? Joseph, for 23 years, even though he knew God was with him, he also hurt. For the past, for the life that he lost, for the family that he lost, for the things that were done to him. And in this moment, it all comes rushing back. This is the second time you see it. Joseph weeps. He's crying because the hurt didn't go away, but he knew God was with him in the middle of the hurt. Look at verse 18. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. Years have passed, and look what Joseph says to them in verse 19. But Joseph said, now this is one of the most powerful verses, one of the most famous verses of this whole story, so I don't want you to miss this. Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Joseph says, I'm not God. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about so that many people should be kept alive as they are today. See, Joseph doesn't just overlook the hurt. He says, guys, what you did to me was wrong. You stole from me all those years. What you did to me was evil. But God has used it for good. And He saved the life of many people because of it. I don't know if you believe this, but God can take the evil, sinful intentions of man, of even you, and He can turn them into something that can accomplish good and something He can get glory from. When you acknowledge that God is with you and you refuse to play God when things are good, what happens is you begin to see that God has worked through all the pain. Look what Joseph goes on to say. He says, so do not fear. I will provide for you and for your little ones. And then he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. He comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You want me to tell you the hardest thing you'll ever do? You probably already know this if you've attempted this before. The hardest thing you'll ever do is forgiving somebody who's hurt you really bad. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do. And yet it's the most courageous thing you'll ever do. To forgive somebody who doesn't deserve your forgiveness. What does a person do when they're confident God is with them, confident God loves them, confident God has a plan for them, and they're confident that you didn't deserve God's love and forgiveness either? You see, when Jesus hung on the cross, He looked out at the people who ignored Him, mocked Him, rejected Him, crucified Him, and He looked at him and He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Did it hurt? It hurt. It cost Him His life. And yet God, in that moment, was reflecting His heart. And when God is with you, all of a sudden there's a confidence that surpasses your circumstance. All of a sudden, all that hurt, the evil intentions of the person who hurt you, they're not nullified. They're not overlooked. You're not saying it was okay. What you're saying is that I know a God who's never left me, who's never forsaken me. He's forgiven me, even though I don't deserve it. So how could I dare not forgive you? As I've been talking this morning, you probably have thought of some people in your mind. Maybe it is a parent. Maybe it was somebody in your life who hurt you. Maybe it's somebody right now at your work, at your school. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe they have no idea the hurt they've caused. Maybe it's an ex-spouse. I guarantee you there's somebody in your mind right now that needs your forgiveness. And you can withhold it. But the crazy thing is about it is that by withholding forgiveness from somebody, you don't imprison them, you imprison yourself. When you do what Jesus did, when you know how much you've been forgiven, and you offer that same forgiveness to somebody else who doesn't deserve it, it sets you free. And it displays the heart of God. So today, here's what I'm asking you to do. Whatever person God has put on your mind, you might need to do something. You might need to write a letter, make a phone call, go visit. I'm not saying that it'll all get better or it'll be easy. I'm not saying that. Maybe you can't even, maybe the person's gone and they're not even here anymore. You can still forgive. It's not something you do one moment and then it's done. It's something you live out each day when you're confident God is with you. God is with you, and He loves you, and He forgives you, and He'll never, ever, ever leave you. Can we forgive? We can, because He's forgiven us. Will you pray with me?